Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm very grateful that you have decided to spend some of your very valuable time with me as I talk about The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, a rather quirky, whimsical, strange fantasy novel. So where do I even begin to describe what this book is about? I guess, well, it sort of starts out in the modern day US, where our main character, Zachary, discovers this rather strange book that, as he starts to read it, realizes that it is about him, or at least part of his life that had occurred when he was younger. So he's obviously freaked out by this discovery and needs to know more about it. And as the story progresses and Zachary dives into this strange story, he discovers that there is this whole entire world literally deep down beneath the real world with magic doors that allow certain people to access it, that is this kind of strange magical location that sort of reminded me a little bit of the world in Piranesi, in that it is this vast sprawling network of hallways and rooms, statues and books, and really this entire world that is created by Erin Morgenstern is definitely a world that is designed for book lovers, because everywhere you look in these hallways and rooms there are just shelves and shelves of books and piles of books, and everywhere you go there are books. So this is a world that is essentially a book lover's paradise. However, it becomes clear that this world is a world that is sort of very much on the decline, that this was once a grand and wonderful and magical world, but at the point where we discover it in this story, there's almost nobody to be found in this entire world, and it's decaying and falling apart and really kind of on its last legs. And then as we get deeper and deeper into the world of this story, it just becomes more and more strange and weird and hard to explain. Now, it is written in a very interesting manner in that we start out with these seemingly very different stories where we'll start one storyline and then jump to another completely different timeline and set of characters and experiences, and then we'll jump to another one that's altogether different again. And as the book progresses, many or most of these sort of individual stories are woven together into the grand overall narrative, which is some, I guess, pretty masterful story writing on the part of Erin Morgenstern. And when I get into the themes here in a second, you will discover that a big theme in this book is the theme of storytelling. What is a story? What makes a story? And we'll get into that in a second. But when I talk about the writing style, I do need to mention that while much of it is serious-ish in kind of a whimsical and weird manner, there is a certain amount of humor woven through it, and here are a couple of examples. This one has to do with a character named Alina, who is a librarian, and it says, Alina laughs and one of the other librarians shushes her. Zachary gives her a wave as he leaves, relishing the librarian on librarian shushing. It's kind of funny. I'm a former library employer. In fact, my very first real job in high school, other than mowing lawns and babysitting and that sort of thing, was working in the local public library as a grade 9 student. I spent 3 years working at the library. So I have a fondness for libraries and for the library experience, and I found that particular passage kind of amusing. Here's another quick example. Zachary is pondering some deep issues while taking a bath here, and it says, he sighs and sinks below the surface, remaining under until he has to return for oxygen-related reasons. That kind of quirky, humorous turn of phrase sort of gives an idea of how this book is written. This next quick quote is for you cat owners out there. The acolyte and the painter walk down empty halls toward an unmarked door. Only a single cat notices them in this moment, and though the cat recognizes this mistake for what it is, he does not interfere. It is not the way of cats to interfere with fate. So this magical world with all the books in it also happens to have a bunch of cats wandering around in it, which makes it all that much more appealing to me. Even though I am quite allergic to cats, I do love to watch live streams of cat rescues that show kittens that are just kind of living their daily lives, playing and sleeping. It's just something that calms my mind and helps with the PTSD, so it's something that I enjoyed about the book too. This final little humorous bit comes towards the end of the book, and it says, "I don't really talk to people anymore. I know I should, but it's hard. I was seeing this guy who bartends at the Adjective Noun for a while, and he was nice, but I kind of let it fizzle." I love that a bar was called the Adjective Noun. Now, despite this humor that's sprinkled throughout, it is largely a serious kind of fantasy novel here. And there are a few things that made me think a bit too. The first example is here. Zachary's friend asks him to come out to a particular event, and it says, "The impulse to say no that Zachary has for pretty much anything that involves talking to people arises automatically." So that's certainly an impulse that is very familiar to me, as is the next little quote here. This one involves Zachary and his own kind of self-thoughts, the voices in his head. And it says, "He slides on a pair of brown suede shoes that could have been tailor-made. Cobbler-made for him." And then the italicized text indicates that he's thinking to himself. It says, "Maybe they have elves who measure feet and make shoes while you sleep," the voice in his head suggests. And again, some more italicized text. It says, "I thought you were the practical voice of reason," head voice Zachary thinks back, but receives no response. So he's got these sort of two voices having a conversation in his own head, which is kind of relatable to a certain extent. As is this next quick statement. Dorian runs a hand through his still sticky, graying hair, feeling too old for all of these marvels and wondering when he went from young and faithful and obedient to confused and adrift and middle-aged. But he knows exactly when it was, because that moment haunts him still. Confused, adrift, and middle-aged. Certainly relatable. And finally, this particular motto that came up is one that hit me on a fairly deep level too. "What does it say?" Zachary asks. "Know thyself," Dorian says. "Mirabelle is fond of embellishment. I'm amazed she had the time in this weather." "That's half the Rollins family motto," Zachary says. "What's the other half?" "And learn to suffer." Know thyself and learn to suffer. Certainly hits home to somebody who has been chronically ill their entire life. Before I go on to talk about some of the themes of the book and what I thought of it overall, let me pause just for a quick second to send my love out to my Patreon supporters. Thank you especially to my higher tier supporters, Joanna, Paul, Osmadas Perfect, and Mojodam. Your support really means the world to me. I'm so grateful for it. And if you're interested in supporting me in such a deep and meaningful way, go to Patreon and check out Josh Yaks. I would sure appreciate it. But back to the Starless Sea now. So the Starless Sea, in my opinion, as much as it's about anything in all its weird strangeness, I think is about books and stories. It is, in a sense, an ode to books from an obvious book lover, like I said, with this really strange, magical setting that has books everywhere. It also talks about stories, but it doesn't just talk about them, it also tells stories. So throughout the book, we're getting these little vignettes of stories being told. And like I said, many of them are sort of wound together in the overall narrative as the book progresses, but there are certainly individual stories being told in the book. Having recently read the first trilogy in the Seven Waters series, this is something that I had gotten used to from reading those three books, because scattered throughout those three books, the characters would often just sit down and tell a story. And it's not necessarily a story that had to do with the plot of the book, but it was just a story being told within the overall story. And so that's something that the Starless Sea does as well here. Let me read a few quick quotes about books and stories then. This is a conversation between Zachary and his friend Dorian. "Did you get the book?" Dorian asks him. "Yes, I did," Zachary says. "But before I give it to you, you're going to tell me why I did that." "You did that because I asked you nicely," Dorian says, and it doesn't annoy Zachary as much as he expects it to. "And because it belongs to me, not to them, as much as the book belongs to anyone. I got your book back for you, you got mine back for me." I like that statement, "as much as the book belongs to anyone," which sort of implies that stories are something that belongs to the community as a whole, I suppose. Which goes back way back to ancient times before writing and print, where oral storytelling was an important part of life. Here's another book quote. "The books. Do you have a particular favorite?" Simon asks. Eleanor considers this. It is not a question she has ever been asked, but a book comes to mind. "I do. I do. It's..." Eleanor pauses. "Would you like to read it?" she asks, instead of trying to explain it. Books are always better when read rather than explained. Isn't that the truth? Here I am trying to explain this book that's definitely much better off read, particularly given its kind of strangeness. Here's a reference to a very specific book. Let's see if you recognize this one. The characters are actually clearly referencing another fantasy novel that I've read some years in the past, and let's see if you recognize it by how the characters talk about it. "He regrets leaving the book in the cottage. He looks through the books on their shelves. Many are unfamiliar and strange. A heavy volume with footnotes and a raven on its cover pulls his attention more than the others, and he finds himself so drawn into its tale of two magicians in England that he loses track of time." Is that enough clues for you? It is clearly referencing Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, written by Susanna Clarke, the author of Piranesi, interestingly enough. I just thought it was interesting that they referenced that particular book, since it's one that I've read in the past. I thought it was decent. I really loved the prose, the writing style of that particular book, but overall found it slightly boring, just as a quick note on that book. Now, getting back to stories. What is a story? Here we have an interesting definition of it. One character is speaking and says, "No, each one's different. They have similar elements, though. All stories do, no matter what form they take. Something was, and then something changed. Change is what a story is, after all." And that is one of the main premises of this book, is that stories are about change, and change are what makes stories. It's an interesting idea. Is it one that you agree with? It's something I would love to hear about if you would take the time to leave a comment. What do you think defines a story? Is that an accurate description of what a story is? Please do let me know. So with that in mind, this final quote here talks about who we are as people. Simon stares at him and blinks. "We are the stars," he answers, as though it is the most obvious of facts, afloat in a sea of metaphors and misdirections. "We are all stardust and stories." That kind of makes sense to me. We are all living our own story. Much of it is being created for us. We do obviously have a hand in how the story plays out, but our life is our own narrative that's created in the brief time we have to live. So I kind of like that statement. But moving on to what I thought about the Starless Sea as a whole. This is a book that has been kind of divisive in terms of the opinions I've read about it. I've watched some videos from booktubers who have said that it is their favorite book they've ever read, or amongst their favorites. And I've seen at least one other booktuber who said that she hated the book, couldn't stand it. And it is a weird book. I've mentioned this before. It starts off feeling very normal, modern day. It is, I guess, what you would call a portal fantasy, in that the characters go from the modern world through these magical doorways and end up in this whole magical fantasy world. And so it starts off, like I said, feeling very familiar. And then as the book progresses in this fantasy world, things become stranger and stranger and weirder, and I was along for the ride and feeling pretty good about it for about the first 350, 400 pages of this 570 page book, and I was just kind of allowing myself to sit back and enjoy the ride, because yes, it got very strange and a lot of it was just weird, but it was done so in a pretty whimsical and fun manner. I was allowing myself to suspend my disbelief as things got increasingly strange and just kind of enjoy the quirkiness of it. But as the book progressed more and more, and I got into the final quarter to a third or so of the book, and things got increasingly weird, it started to become just a bit too much for me. I started to enjoy it less and less, and eventually found myself wishing that it would just end. So while there is a lot that I appreciated and enjoyed about the book. The things I mentioned previously, the humor and the fun, whimsical, book-filled world. I might have enjoyed it more if this world wasn't a dying world that was well past its prime, whose days were coming to an end. And I felt like that we as the readers had missed the most amazing, fun, magical parts of this world because those days were behind us before we even started the book. So at the end of it all, I ended up giving it a rating of 5.5 out of 10, which places it kind of between okay and good on my 1 to 10 scale. I think if it hadn't dragged on so long, if it hadn't gone so completely absurd, if it had wrapped up in a neater manner, it could have been a much, much higher rating. But unfortunately, by the end of it, I just wasn't enjoying the experience nearly as much as I was enjoying it through the first 3/4 to 2/3 of the book. So that's sort of where I landed on the rating. The last little bit I will read just to close up here is a book that I appreciated as a person who is not religious, not interested in spiritual stuff, but who has an endless fascination with science and the wonders of the natural world. And here's the quote. "At one point, I asked her if she believed there was magic in the world, and she told me, 'The world is magic, honey child.' Maybe it is. I don't know." So I'll wrap it up there and throw it back to you. Please let me know what books you've been reading, what you've been enjoying lately, and like I said earlier, let me know what you think about stories and perhaps how they define us as humans. I would really be interested in carrying on that conversation. So thank you so much for watching, and please do let me know below what thoughts came up as I was talking about all that. Cheers. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video. That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers. And this next quick quote is just something that calls this final little humorous bit as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek the impulse to say no that Zachary has. Let me just pause for a quick moment to send a big thank you to May. As much as it's about anything in all its weird and talks about stories, but it doesn't just talk about stories. Definitely, it's something I love to chat with.